Good morning, everyone. We're looking at the first chapter of the book of Daniel today. It's part of our series on God at work. And we're looking today at how we can be authentic in our workplace. How can we be true to what we believe? How can we stand up for what is right in the workplace? How can we have integrity? Integrity is a great word. We often think of it as meaning being honest and true in our morals, which is true. That is a good interpretation. But I like to think of the word integral, where everything in our lives comes together. There's no division between the secular and the sacred. We integrate everything in our lives with no distinction. Simply put, how do we maintain our beliefs and take them from a Sunday morning through to a Monday morning? So we look at Daniel, who teaches us a lot about this. Before we look into the chapter, which we're going to do, and we're going to look for signs of God working in this situation, we're going to look at Daniel's response to the situation, and we're going to find some application for ourselves and some challenges. But here's a quick overview of the book of Daniel. It's a weird mixture. If you've ever read the whole book of Daniel, most people give up after about the first 5 chapters. It's got the whole range from the simple Sunday school stories right through to bewildering apocalyptic prophetic visions towards the end. But here are some of the highlights of the book of Daniel. We have Daniel in the lion's den. There he is, looking like an old man, which he probably would have been by the time he got thrown to the lions. We have in chapter 3 Daniel's friends when they were thrown into the fiery furnace, which was King Nebuchadnezzar's version of hell, where he threw people who wouldn't bow down and worship his statue. But the 3 friends escaped. We might be familiar with Belshazzar's feast. Nice bit of Rembrandt there. His painting of that scene where King Belshazzar had a feast, and a mysterious hand appeared and wrote judgment upon him upon the wall. And Daniel came and interpreted the judgment of God, and that night Belshazzar died. We have in chapter 2, Daniel again interpreting a very strange and frightening dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had of a tall statue. We won't go into the meaning of that now, but it had a lot to do with the great kingdoms of the world. And that prophecy even has meaning for us today. The ultimate message of that dream was that Christ inevitably will reign supreme, which is good to remember in the midst of changing world events these days. The later chapters of Daniel, a lot less well known, as I said, full of strange and what can be confusing prophecies with strange animals fighting like this. If you're really into end-time prophecies, go home and read it this afternoon. And if you understand it, let me know. But there's a veritable feast of visions towards the end of Daniel. So it's a remarkable life he had. One minute he was the confidant and the advisor to kings who admired his faith, who looked at Daniel and could see God working in his life. The next minute, some of those same kings nearly murdered him for that same faith. So it's a funny mix, his life. But it's helpful for us as we are ambassadors and witnesses for Christ in the world to see the way God was working. Maybe there might be times when people admire our integrity as we stand firm for Christ. There might be other times when people persecute us or dislike us or reject us for that faith. There's a story about the great 18th century evangelist John Wesley. I don't know if it's a true story, but it's a good one to use. He was traveling the country preaching the gospel, as he did, on his horse. And there's a story that he started to get a little bit uncomfortable that he was being welcomed by people. Now you might think, why would that be a problem? Well, he suspected that he might be watering down the gospel a bit, that he might not be quite giving the full-on truth about God's judgment as well as God's saving grace. And he thought, are people becoming nice? Because he was used to not everybody liking what he said. So he got on his knees by the side of the road and he prayed and he said, Lord, in your wisdom and mercy, save me from compromising the truth. I don't want to gain the favor of people. I just want to proclaim your truth. Give me courage to do that, whatever the reaction. Now, apparently a farmer who'd heard him speaking that morning and didn't like what he said, saw him praying, picked up a brick and threw it at him. John Wesley avoided it, but he got down on his knees again and he said, thank you, Lord. Thank you for showing me that there are still people who don't like the message I'm preaching. Because he realized that in Scripture we know that Paul, we know that Daniel and many others, and of course Jesus, didn't always get a good reception for standing for the truth. And if Jesus was the master, we as his pupils are no greater than he, and we can expect the same sometimes. Now that might sound very daunting, the idea of suffering for our faith, the idea of standing firm against all opposition, to have that resolution to proclaim the full truth of what we believe. But in this first chapter of Daniel, we see a young man beginning on this journey, and it begins for him with something relatively simple. So let's turn to the first chapter of Daniel, which you'll find on page 883 if you're following the Bibles at the side. If not, it'll be on the screen. Daniel chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave to them new names. To Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. So we begin this passage with the shocking news that during the reign of King Jehoiakim, the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem. Even more shocking than the holy city falling is that God allowed it to happen. The Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the hands of the Babylonians. Because under the reign of King Jehoiakim, things had got to an all-time low in the kingdom of Judah. The people worshipped idols over and above the living God. The law of Moses was neglected. Sin increased. And this was a promised land, yes, but it came with the promise that it still belonged to God, and he would only keep the people in it and allow them to live there if they remained in covenant with him. Otherwise, he would remove them from it and take it away from them. And we see that warning become a reality as God acts out his judgment using the Babylonians in that process. He allows this foreign tyrant to do the unthinkable, to take the holy city and to take the treasures from the temple and put them in the temple of his own false god. But more than that, he takes the next generation, the young, healthy generation, and he takes them back to Babylon. That's a cruel thing to do to a people, to take those who are well and the hope of a generation and to remove them. But God's promises for his people were not derailed, as the book of Daniel shows. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, clever king, you've got to hand it to him. He took these young, strong people from the royal families and the nobility, and he could have killed them. That would have been terrible for the people of Judah. That would have been a simple thing to do, to kill them. But even better than that, why not take them and make them your own? Assimilate them into your culture so that they become fruitful for you. It's a win-win situation. In one move, you destroy your enemy by taking away the next generation. But you also strengthen your own kingdom by taking them for your own. And there's a process that we can read here that Nebuchadnezzar used in order to do this. Quite a clever process. It's useful for us to know this process because it's the same process that the world would do to us to try and draw it into its way of thinking, to try and claim us as its own. Starts very simply with language. When you learn the language of a new country, you start to feel comfortable there. You start to understand what people are saying, obviously. You don't feel like an outsider anymore. And that leads to the next step. You can then learn about the country's history and the country's culture. You start to think in the same way as the people of the country you're in. And if that process happens early enough, it can set you up for a lifetime of developing the same values as those people. It's not clear how young Daniel and his friends were, but we would think that they were probably in their early to mid-teens when this happened. They're given a new name. That's the next step. Shakespeare wrote, "What's in a name? Does it really matter what name we have?" But in this case, it probably did matter a lot. If we look at the names that they had, the Hebrew names, they're very significant. Daniel means God is my judge. Hananiah, beloved of the Lord. Mishael, who is as God. Azariah, the Lord is my help. These are names that acknowledge the work of God in the bearer of the name. But that's no good for the Babylonians. They don't want these four young men to be reminded of their families and their faith and their homeland. So they give them new names, Babylonian names, each one reflecting the new family, the new culture, the new faith. Daniel's given the name Belteshazzar. Some people think that refers to Bel, the Babylonian god, Bel's prince. The other three names, when I was growing up, there was always a joke that these three names were my shack, your shack, and a bungalow. I always think of those three names, so forgive me if I slip into them. But Hananiah became Shadrach, which refers to the sun god of the Babylonians. Mishael probably refers to Venus. and Azariah became Abednego, the servant of Nego, another pagan god. So, language, culture, name, and one more step, privilege. The king wants them to eat what he eats. He wants them to enter into his service. It's not rocket science that if you treat people well, they're more susceptible to your way of thinking. So he feeds them with the best. He gives their minds the best education. He gives their bodies the best food. It's a funny time, isn't it, that time of early teens, when you begin to grow up a little bit, you lose a bit of your innocence. You start to move away slightly from your parents. You start to question their faith, their values. Quite rightly, it's part of growing up. It's scary to watch if you're a parent to see teenagers go through that. But it's part of your maturing. It can't be avoided. And if in those years you have support and love and people around you to help you through it, you can start to develop in those years characteristics, and the choices you make can last you right through the rest of your life. If you have a vulnerable time with maybe not so good influences, you can develop character traits that you wouldn't really want for the rest of your life. And I guess most of us have a mixture of both of those things. And so it was for these four friends, very young, impressionable, and the decisions they're making now are impacting them for the rest of their lives. Now, for Daniel, it looks like that the issue of food became a step too far for him. I don't think he was a vegetarian. I don't think this is about he didn't want to eat meat. I think it's to do with the fact that probably the food given to the king had been offered to idols, or at the very least, it wasn't kosher. It didn't follow the strict Mosaic laws that God had laid out that were for the people, the chosen people. So, for whatever reason, Daniel wasn't prepared to compromise with the food. He'd obviously set limits on what he was prepared to do. Learning a new language, learning a new culture, even having your name changed doesn't necessarily contravene God's laws, but the food for Daniel did. It was something that would defile one of God's chosen people. This was the moment to take a stand. Now, how easy would it have been for Daniel to give in? He probably knew at this stage that he would never see his homeland again. Who knows, his family might even have been dead. He could have just made the best of it, just settled into a new life of privilege. After all, if we read the prophet Jeremiah, God even encourages his people in exile to settle in the land of exile, to take wives, have sons and daughters, to look out for the welfare of the people who were holding them captive, so that they could be free in the new land, free to worship God. But God didn't say this so that they could forget him. And Daniel knew that. He still wanted to be able to worship the living God. So it says Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. It's a great word, resolved. It's a word which means you make up your mind to do something or to not do something, but you make up your mind before the issue arises. You choose your path before you even get to the crossroads. It makes us wonder if Daniel, back in Jerusalem, was already in the habit of obeying God. Maybe in a land that had tended to forget God under an evil king, Daniel and his family maybe were still in the habit of obeying God. You know, often the crucial decisions we make, the firm stands that we have to take, they don't come out of the blue. Big life-changing decisions are prepared for with years and years and day by day and moment by moment small decisions. There's a tendency for us, isn't there, to look at the big and momentous things as the things that change us. We look for and are hungry for the awesome event. We're seeking that high-impact moment of revelation or worship or prayer in order to make us grow. But God is often looking at and using the small decisions we make. In his mercy, he gives us relatively simple, exercises to do, over and over again each day, choices to make, so that the bigger, more difficult things can be attempted. Faithfulness in small things can lead to big things. So in seeking not to eat the food, maybe God helped Daniel to see something relatively simple he could grow in, something he could resolve not to do, so that he could be ready for the bigger challenges that, if we read on in the book of Daniel, we see that he had to face. So the small stepping stone you overcome today may be preparing you for the big hurdle, months or even years down the road. So, Daniel took a stand. He resolved not to take the food. But how he did it is very important. He does it in a very positive way. He doesn't go on hunger strike. He simply asks the man in charge if he can be excused of eating the defiled food. This is a good model for us as we stand firm to our principles in the workplace or amongst family and friends. We don't have to be militant about it. It's interesting because it says that God caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. You see, God can cause other people to look well on us, to have sympathy for us. He can soften their hearts, to be compassionate to us. Doesn't always happen, but God can do that. But we will hijack that if we set out to be rude or obnoxious about our beliefs. It's no good doing the right thing in the wrong way. God might open someone's ears to hear what we have to say, but arrogance on our part might deafen those ears. So Daniel goes to the proper person in charge and makes a reasonable request. And the eunuch in charge, his response gives us an insight into his life, because he says, if I do this, I'm at risk of literally losing my head if the king sees that you guys aren't healthy. It reminds us that people often react in a certain way because there's pressure from above upon them. But Daniel is concerned with even a high authority than the king, and he doesn't give up. So he goes to the steward, the next one down, and again he gives a reasonable request to him. Let's try this thing out. Test your servant for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables. Give us nothing but water. Then see what happens. See if we're less healthy than the other guys. This shows a lot of faith from Daniel. He's confident that obedience to God will have results. Virtue has its own reward, but Daniel even expects more than that. He expects that there'll be something that shows these guys are even healthier. And that's what happens. At the end of 10 days, they look healthier, better nourished than any of the young men who ate the raw food. So there's a physical demonstration in the young Hebrew men. There's also an intellectual demonstration of this obedience. These 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. So there's a physical demonstration, there's an intellectual one, there's a spiritual one, because it goes on to say Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. God gave him a spiritual gift as well for his obedience. And we see that when the 4 young men are presented to the king, he found none equal to them. They entered the king's service, and they were 10 times better than everyone else. Now, we have to be careful here not to draw false conclusions from this. Are we saying that if we stand firm for our beliefs in the workplace, does it mean that we'll automatically look healthier than everyone else? Does it mean we'll suddenly have an intellectual ability above everyone else, find it very easy to pass our exams? Will we have amazing spiritual gifts? Will we excel above everyone else, 10 times better than everyone else? Will we go straight to the top job? Well, who knows? It certainly happened in this case. It may happen for us. But what we can definitely say is that there are challenges here for us, and there are encouragements here for us as we see how God works and how Daniel responded. See, like Daniel and his friends, we are exiles. When we come to faith in Christ as our Savior, we become citizens of heaven. This is no longer our home. So in every situation we are in this world, we are exiles. But the world seeks to assimilate us. The world seeks to teach us its language of cynicism and hate, whereas we are to have the language of love and truth. The world tries to give us a different name other than our name of Christ and Christian. So the world tries to give us good things to eat. It tries to attract us with the things that will make us popular and accepted. So these are the challenges. Number one, where do we draw the line? What seemingly harmless activity will we not take part in so that we avoid the danger of becoming like everyone else and we lose our distinctiveness as a Christian? It's worth asking God very directly, what is there you want me to stop doing? Or what is there you want me to start doing? We can interrogate God a little bit and ask him specifically to show us these things. And are we then resolved ahead of time not to do these things? Number two, are we taking seriously the small and relatively easy choices that we can make now? The pattern of our future choices can be set now. And let's not try and leapfrog over the simple things in front of us. Are we, like John Wesley, realistic about the opposition we might endure if we are really open about our faith? Are we careful, therefore, not to compromise in order to avoid opposition? Daniel, as we saw, went from being honored by one king to being thrown to the lions by another for the same faith that he expressed. At the same time, number four, are we acting with politeness? What's our attitude as we express these things? Are we too militant sometimes? Are we too obnoxious, too self-righteous? Do we cooperate with the boss and the organization as much as we can without disobeying God? Do we form good relationships? Paul wrote, if it is possible, so far as it depends upon you, live peaceably with all. An excellent practice maybe is to specifically pray for individuals. Pray for your boss. Pray for those people who you employ. Pray very specifically about people with whom you work and live. So there are some challenges, but here's some encouragement. We see from the book of Daniel that God had a hand on, as Rod was praying earlier, on empires. God had his hand on Nebuchadnezzar, and he used Nebuchadnezzar in order to enact his judgment upon his own people. And do read through the book of Daniel. Some of it's quite difficult, but some amazing bits. One of the greatest bits is what happened to Nebuchadnezzar later on, how God dealt with him and brought him into a realization that there was a living God. So God acts within empires, but God also acts within individuals like Daniel. For every world ruler whom God allows to take power, God also has his faithful people within that country through whom he works. For every organization that seems to have forgotten God or indeed be anti-God, there are those within it, God's faithful people through whom he is working. In every workplace, school, family that has a hostility to God and the things of God, there is you and I called to be faithful like Daniel. So take heart, Daniel was no great bishop or evangelist. He was basically a civil servant in the Babylonian Empire. But God used him. He was willing to take a stand. So God was able to fulfill his promises in that place and at that time. You know, in one sense, the time and place that you're in now isn't as important as how faithful you are to God in that context. Shall we just pray to close?